original recording of this lecture, lecture 4, the audio didn't work in class for some reason, and a student had been recording it anyways, and so he gave me the audio, which was great, but I felt the audio quality was a bit low, especially after the break that happens halfway through the class. And so as a result, I thought I would just re-record this lecture so that you can hear it, hopefully a lot clearer than in the original video. Okay, what I won't do is I'm not going to actually write out the notes because I have a copy of the notes, and I'll give you this. This will ensure that you have the exact same copy of the notes from last year's class, and so it will we probably won't use the full 2 hours because I won't have to write everything out. But I'll still try and go slowly. I like writing things out because it forces me to go slowly. So I'll try and keep a slow pace so that you can follow along, even though I'm not writing everything out. Okay, so this lecture is a continuation of the last lecture. So in the last lecture, we started looking at HTTPS as an example of an attack tree. This example is going to span across a couple more lectures. So it's going to be a very detailed, involved attack tree. And it's because there's actually a lot to say about how you might attack this particular protocol. And it's also an interesting example because the attacks are not all technical attacks. Attacks may involve humans, they might involve organizations or governments, they might involve, on the technical side, cryptography, they might involve software, they might involve hardware, they might involve network level attacks. And so there's so many different kinds of examples, and that's what makes this an interesting example. Okay, so last class, just to sort of reorient ourselves and myself as well, we have a user, Alice, and she's connected to a web server like Facebook or Twitter or Google, something like that. And this web server is using SSL, okay, HTTPS. So that's great. So what does that actually mean? So what it means is that Alice has a secure tunnel, if you will, to that server. And what that tunnel means is that the data that goes in the tunnel is protected from someone who might try to look at that data. So it provides confidentiality. And it's also protected in terms of the integrity of the data from someone who might want to change that data in terms of something else. Okay, and then a third property that the tunnel gives you, which we'll talk about, is it also tells you something about where that tunnel ends. Okay, now if you want to break this tunnel, first off, you have to be in a position to see the tunnel. So for the purposes of the attack tree, you'll remember that the root node of the attack tree is that the adversary is already in the middle. So we're not going to worry about how they happen to get in the middle of this communication. If SSL works correctly, if the tunnel works correctly, it doesn't matter who's in the middle. That's the whole point of the tunnel, is you can send information that's sensitive over the public internet, and it literally should not matter, where your traffic goes, what country it goes into. It shouldn't matter who happens to be on the wire. And when I say on the wire, you're probably thinking people that are sort of in the middle, like a big telecom company or something like that. And so that's a part of the people that are in the middle. But the interesting part too is the people that are very close to Alice. So Alice is over here, on the end of it. And the very first thing is, the packet, first off, will bounce around in her computer a little bit. Okay, so the adversary could actually be in her computer. It might go over Wi-Fi. Okay, so that Wi-Fi is being provided by somewhere. She's at Starbucks. Okay, so Starbucks is running the Wi-Fi network. Does that mean they see all of the traffic? And so the tunnel should start, before it even hits the Wi-Fi router. And so no, the Starbucks shouldn't be able to see it. And then Starbucks has an ISP. And so they shouldn't be able to see it either. And then it goes into the sort of backbone of the internet, and there's all the big servers and things. And that's where you might worry about like government surveillance or something like that. And then similarly with the web server, it's going to pop out and there's going to be more retail services that get that traffic to the particular web server themselves. Okay, so we're really talking about anywhere along this line. So if you're going to break into the tunnel, or sorry, if you're just going to subvert this whole thing, there's basically three types of things that you might do. Okay, so what we'll spend most of today's lecture on is how do you break into the tunnel. So we don't really know what that means, but conceptually, theoretically, there should be some way to break the protections that the tunnel is giving you. Okay, so that's one thing that you can do. The second thing, what we talked about last class, we talked about, well, what if you can't break the tunnel? Is it really true that the tunnel doesn't reveal any information? And the answer is no. I mean, it does actually reveal quite a bit of information, right? You can see, for example, it doesn't hide the name of the web server that you're visiting. Okay, so the content of the pages and the requests that are going back and forth, that might be hidden. But sometimes just knowing the web server that a particular user is visiting is that's the information that the adversary is trying to gain. And the adversary might take actions just based on that information. We also talked about how even though it's encrypted, encryptions have different lengths, and also websites tend to weave together content from multiple other sites. And so every HTTPS website has a kind of fingerprint. Okay, and so even though it's all encrypted, it kind of looks the same in terms of the size of packets and what resources are being pulled in from where. And so you can tell a lot. There's a lot of information that you can learn about just by looking at the traffic, even if you can't actually decrypt it. Okay, and then the final thing that we'll start talking about at the end of this lecture, and we'll spend the next maybe 2 lectures talking about, it's a really big topic, which is how do you know that the tunnel ends where you think it ends, right? So all Alice knows is she has this tunnel, she's dropping packets into it, but how does she know that the tunnel actually ends at Google, for example, if she's visiting Google? How does she know that the information only comes out the other end when it's already at Google's server? How does she know that the tunnel doesn't end early? How does she know the tunnel doesn't end within her own computer? How does she know the tunnel doesn't end at the Wi-Fi router? How does she know the tunnel doesn't end at the adversary that's sitting somewhere else in the middle of this connection? Okay, so we need to be able to identify where the tunnel is going. Otherwise, it's actually completely useless. It's useless to put information into a tunnel if you don't know where it ends, because if the adversary can get the tunnel to end at them, then they can read everything. And so all the protection of the tunnel, it ends up not providing any meaningful sort of protection. Okay, so like I said, last lecture we spent a lot of time looking at this. So in terms of this lecture, we're going to do all of breaking into the tunnel, and we'll start looking at subverting server authentication as well. Okay, so let's think about breaking into the tunnel. Okay, so what does it mean to break into the tunnel? First off, we should define what the tunnel is. Okay, and I'm actually not going to define what the tunnel is. I will tell you that the tunnel involves cryptography. I will tell you that if you're interested in, the actual cryptography of this tunnel, you could take a course like 6110. And when I teach it, I actually teach you all the different sort of cryptographic primitives that go into making this tunnel. And it turns out that it's pretty complicated. And it involves lots of things. There's some sort of key exchange, which may be based on Diffie-Hellman. It might be based on some public key cryptography. There's signatures involved in trying to authenticate the parties, especially in the Diffie-Hellman case. Then you switch over, you have some symmetric keys that are used for encryption, as well as authentication. So you have MAX, and you have some sort of block cipher, or you have some sort of stream cipher. There's extractors that are in there, pseudo-random number generators to generate session keys. I mean, this tunnel really uses, everything in cryptography. Okay, so it's very involved, and you really have to take a full course in order to understand it. But what we could do in the case of this course is we can try and forget about all the details, forget about the how, forget about how it works. Let's just talk, what is it at the end of the day that actually is protecting this tunnel, okay? And so the answer is that the tunnel is really being protected by two keys. So you do a bunch of really fancy cryptography, and at the end of the day, Alice knows some secret value, and the web server that's on the other side of this tunnel also knows that same value, and no one else in the world knows that value. Okay, so all the fancy crypto gets you to the point where these two parties know a particular value, and we'll call it a key, and it's going to be a secret. Okay, and when you have that secret key, then what you can do is you can turn around and you can use encryption, what's called symmetric key encryption, and you can use authentication, which hopefully is built into the encryption itself, but it might be a separate algorithm called a message authentication code, or a MAC. Okay, so if all these crypto terms mean nothing to you, it doesn't matter. Okay, just, that's for your interest if you've already taken 6110. At the end of the day, just know that somehow a bunch of cryptography happens, and Alice and the person at the end of the tunnel know the same value. And I keep saying that because we still have to solve the problem of how do you know the person at the other end of the tunnel. And that will also involve keys. They're not going to be the same type of keys. It's going to be something called a public key, but we'll get there. Okay, so don't worry about that for now. Right now, Alice and the web server know a secret key, and it's symmetric, okay? Meaning they both know the same value. Okay, so now we want to break the tunnel. So what does that mean? So the first thing that we could do is we could just try and steal that key. If we can get that key, then we can decrypt things that are in that tunnel as well, okay? And so whether or not you can get the key depends on basically if you can compromise Alice or you can compromise the web server. And generally that would be some sort of flaw in the software implementation that's generating these keys, storing the keys, and using the keys. Okay, so the first sub attack that I'll put in is a key theft attack, and there what you'll do is you'll be able to steal it, based on probably the implementation itself. Okay. The second thing you can do is, let's say you don't have the key. Well, can you look at the values that go back and forth? So these values are encrypted. When they're encrypted, we call them ciphertext. So there's these ciphertext, which is an encrypted version of the data that's going back and forth. And could you just look at the ciphertext and decrypt it, for example, even if you didn't have the key, right? And so it is theoretically possible. The cipher could be so weak that you could just look at it and decrypt it even though you didn't have the key, maybe by guessing a bunch of keys, or there might be something more sophisticated you can do. SSL has never been that broken. So the crypto that they use at this level, at the symmetric level, it has always never been that weak, okay? And so what you have to do is you have to do something a little more sophisticated. So the one kind of attack that there's maybe 3 or 4 SSL attacks that I'll give you the names of. We won't go into the nitty-gritty details of that use this type of approach. But what it is it's called a chosen plaintext attack. And so basically what you do is you might have a guess as to what's being encrypted. You might say, hey, I can't just look at it and decrypt it, but I wonder if that is actually an encryption of this particular value. Then what you can do is you can take that guess, you could encrypt it yourself, right? And you could check whether it matches the ciphertext. Now, I'm talking very abstractly, and I'm glossing over all sorts of details. You couldn't actually encrypt it yourself because you don't know the key. And if you did know the key, then you can decrypt as well, because the same key is used for encryption and decryption, okay? But there are ways where you can sort of tell Alice, for example, who's encrypting this, you can give her some content to encrypt. So how does that work? Well, for example, she might be encrypting the content of a website or a request to the website, okay? And so if you could give her the request, and then she takes it and then she encrypts it and sends it off to the server, then you could effectively choose the values that she's encrypting, even though you don't have access to the part of her computer that's actually encrypting the data. And so sometimes there's ways with JavaScript or mixed content and things like that in order for somebody to choose values for someone else to encrypt. Okay. And so anyways, what you'll do is you'll sort of guess some values, and then you can check to see whether they come out to the right values. Now that should be impossible. If the crypto is implemented correctly, it shouldn't matter that somebody's allowed to choose values. The crypto scheme should protect you against it. And in fact, we have levels of security for encryption schemes that basically say whether or not they can protect against that. But that said, sometimes crypto gets kind of complicated, and when you put a whole protocol together, even though the encryption algorithm might provide that, there's some other, there's some other implication of what you chose to do that causes that not to take effect. So that's all I'll say about that now. Another kind of partial decryption is one that's very specific, is when data is encrypted, it should look random. Okay, there's a sort of rule that says that. And so every bit should be as likely to be a 1 or as a 0. Now, there was one encryption algorithm called RC4 that was not producing ciphertexts that were uniformly random. Okay, so what you could do is it would take a lot of trials, like maybe 10,000 trials or something like that. But if you ask for the encryption of something 10,000 times, you could start looking at certain positions in the ciphertext, and there were only a few, and you could make a good guess as to what was actually encrypted there. So that's another example where you're not just wholesale decrypting information, you're getting some partial information, but that partial information is useful to you. And if what you're trying to steal is, say, a password, or more likely it would be what's called a cookie. Cookies are something we'll talk at the end of the course about. But if you're trying to steal a cookie, which lets you, once you've put your password in, the cookie keeps you logged in, then what you can do is you can guess. So even if you're not 100% sure, but you know that you're 80% sure the bit is a particular value, you can guess in a much more educated way, and then you're going much quicker. Something that normally you wouldn't be able to try enough guesses, you might be able to guess enough because you have some information about the distribution of those bits, which you gleaned from the fact that this encryption was not perfectly unbiased. Okay, so I'll say more about those two examples. Another way to break encryption, not necessarily directly or indirectly, not necessarily directly, but an indirect way of breaking it, is you can try and downgrade SSL. So SSL didn't always use the most secure encryption functions. And sometimes there were, the actual encryption function was fine, but the way they implemented it was not fine. And what I can tell you is that the most current version of TLS 1.3 is fine. There's no problems at all in it that we know of. Nobody knows of any attacks on it. And so that's great. If Alice, always uses TLS 1.3 with the web server, and the web server supports it, then there's no particular problem. The problem is that the web server might say, well, I don't want to, let's say someone shows up and they're using SSL 3.0, which is an old encryption algorithm. Sorry, it's an old SSL version, which has old encryption algorithms in it. Then they don't want to say, oh, you can't come to our website because your browser's too old, right? They don't want to say that. They don't want to turn away customers for that. And so web servers may support all these old SSL versions, okay? And part of the trick of SSL is you can't use SSL itself to say which version you want to use. If Alice said, hey, I want to use TLS version 1.3, okay? She doesn't have a tunnel yet, right? She's sending that information so that they know how to build the tunnel. So when she sends that information, she doesn't have the tunnel yet. So she has to send that before the tunnel's built so they know how to build the tunnel. Therefore, the tunnel's not protecting the fact that she sent that information. And so the adversary might change that. The adversary sitting in the middle, so they see Alice saying, hey, web server, let's make a TLS 1.3 tunnel. And the adversary says, oh, actually, Alice wants a SSL 3.0, which is an older version, tunnel. I say it's older because 1.3 and 3.0. I think I covered this earlier, but SSL 3.0 was an early version. There was an earlier version, but then they changed the name to TLS. So it went from SSL 3.0 to TLS 1.0, and then TLS 1.1, 1.2, 1.3. Anyways, the adversary may try and downgrade it. Now, there is actually a really clever protection against that. So basically, once the tunnel is in place, then you say, oh, by the way, when you said that you wanted to use SSL 3.0, did I hear that right? Now that we have the tunnel in place and our messages at least have some integrity, because SSL has always had good integrity from the first version up, because you couldn't really negotiate that. There were problems more on the confidentiality side. And so they would say, oh, by the way, did I hear you right? And then Alice would be like, oh, no, I was asking for 1.3. And then they would detect, oh, there was an error. Okay, so there are preventions against downgrade attacks, but there's also ways to circumvent them, sometimes in older versions. Sometimes it's more of an exploit of the implementation. So whatever library the server is using, even though the protocol is okay, the exact way that the library works, it may allow these downgrades to happen. Okay, so downgrades not as sort of straightforward as it sounds, but there are actual ways of getting it to work. Okay, so the next thing we'll talk about is, or we'll go into detail on key theft. Okay, so if you want to steal keys. All right, so the first thing I'll talk about is a particular attack. It got a lot of press at the time, and it was called Heartbleed. Okay, so Heartbleed was an attack on an SSL library called OpenSSL. And this is a software bug. And I'll say that, even though it was an attack on OpenSSL, and we're going to use this to steal SSL keys, the fact that it was an SSL library is actually irrelevant. Okay, it was actually a coincidence that you were attacking an SSL library. You could have done the same attack if that same vulnerability had been in any library that the server supported. So if this type of attack could have happened in any kind of public-facing service that the web server is providing to anyone on the internet. So it happened to be an OpenSSL, but it could have been in something else. So it's not really, yeah. So it's not directly an SSL attack. It's more of an attack on the server that happens to use SSL as the vulnerability, the SSL library. And then the end result is that you could steal SSL keys. Okay, so OpenSSL, what is it? So this is a library that's used for providing SSL. Typically, it's plugged into Apache. Apache is an open source, free, Linux-based, sort of library for running a server. So the stack is that you have servers that are on the internet, and they're running Linux, and then they run Apache on top of it, and then Apache runs OpenSSL in order to provide it. And that's a very common configuration. It's not the only thing that you'll see out on the web, but I think around at the time of Heartbleed, it was something like a third to maybe, I feel like maybe 40%, somewhere in there, the number of servers that were on the internet that use that particular configuration. So OpenSSL is very popular on the server side, not so common on the client side. So clients are not typically using OpenSSL. They typically use something that comes from comes out of they're typically using something that's provided by the operating system itself. So Windows or Apple will provide a library. And then Firefox comes with its own library called NSS. Okay, so that's Apache. It's, IBM contributes a lot to it, but it is an open source kind of project. Okay, so this OpenSSL library, first off, because it's a server, this library, and because the server accepts SSL connections, anyone on the web can go up to the server and they can, try and open a SSL connection, and then this library is going to get used. Okay, so this library, it's not like something that's internal to the server that people on the internet can't access directly. It's directly accessible from users that are on the internet. Okay, so that makes it, you have to think about hardening the security of it at a sort of different level than you would maybe for a library that didn't have that sort of network facing APIs and things like that. So anyways, okay, so OpenSSL had this feature in it called the heartbeat. Okay, and so this was a service. It was just in there, from I guess the earliest versions of OpenSSL. No one really used it. I think most people forgot that it existed, but it was there. It was turned on by default. So if you just installed it and you didn't bother to do anything beyond the default configuration, it would be there and it would be on. And I think I heard that if I recall correctly, the person who invented OpenSSL, they actually did it to sort of teach themselves a new programming language. I think it was C or C++. And so there were a lot of things that went into the earlier versions of SSL. And part of software projects is that old code often just sits around and it's not removed even if people stop using it. Okay. All right. So the objective of this heartbeat service was basically to say, it was to give the user a way to test whether or not the server had OpenSSL configured and was live with it. And so normally what you could do is you could just open an SSL connection and then you could see that it worked. Okay, but there's a certain amount of overhead. You have to go back and forth. There's a handshake that happens. And so this was, I think, I don't know the exact motivation, but I think it was meant to be a very low, like a lo-fi way of just testing to make sure that the server was on and was configured. Okay. Also, if you open a connection, you don't necessarily know that it's using OpenSSL versus some other library. Okay, so the test was simple. So the user had this service and they could basically just send some data to the server. And if the server was configured correctly, then it would just echo back that exact data. Okay, now a little tweak of it was what you could do is you could send a bunch of data to the server and you could say, actually, I don't want to hear about all of it. It's fine. Just send me the first 3 bytes. Okay. So for example, the user might send to the server A, B, C, D, E, F, and they might say, okay, just send me back 3 bytes. Okay. And then the server would send back to the user A, B, C. Okay. So they would just truncate it to that, and then that would save some memory. And you've already seen that since it can respond with the first 3 bytes, you assume that it could have responded with the 6 bytes if you wanted it to. Okay. All right. Now, let me actually pause for a few seconds and think about, is there a vulnerability here? Okay. What could possibly go wrong? Okay. So one thing that you might think about is, well, you have one number here. And so what if you change this number? So, you could change this number to 6. For example, and then A, B, C, D, E, F, then it would echo back the full A, B, C, D, E, F. But what if you changed it to, I don't know, 10? Okay, so if you change it to 10, you would send A, B, C, D, E, F, and then it would want 10 bytes back. So it would start at the beginning of the string and it would say, okay, here's the first, I'll send the second, I'll send the third, I'll send the fourth, I'll send the fifth, I'll send the 6th. What am I going to do? So you would hope that it would throw an error, right? It would say, oh, like, sorry, you're asking for too many bytes. Okay. But no, what it would actually do is it would take this string, it would put it in RAM, which is the memory of the server. So it would sit here, it put A, B, C, D, E, F somewhere in memory. Okay, and the way it works is it's kind of like a stack. So the most recent data sort of is at the top, and then older data is below it. Okay, and then it would keep going. So if you ask for 10 bytes, it would say, great, I'll send you A, B, C, D, E, F, and then I'll send you the next 4 bytes that happen to be beside it in RAM. Okay, and this is in general, you tend to see these kinds of problems a lot with low-level languages like C, where for data you just kind of remember where the data starts. Okay, so you're like, okay, I know where this data starts. I can see it starting here, and then you want 10 bytes. Great, I'll just spill out 10 bytes. Okay. So you see a lot of attacks like buffer overflow attacks and things like that are related to this. This particular variant we call a buffer underrun attack. And the point is that you're going to get some extra data from the server's RAM. Okay? All right, so big deal. First off, the first question you might have is, well, how big could you go? Okay, so you can go from 6, you can go to 10, you can go to 20. How much data could you actually ask for and it would return it? Turns out it's quite a bit. So we give you 64 kilobytes of data from the server's RAM. Okay, so that's a substantial amount of data. And the next question is, okay, what's sitting in the server's RAM? What are the kinds of things that you could draw out of the server's RAM that happens to be there? Okay, and so the kinds of things that might be sitting in RAM would be anything that was recently, basically anything that the server took in recently and had to do some processing on. So it might be that the user submitted their password and the server has to take the password, hash it, salt it, iterate on it, whatever, and it has to go and check whether that password's correct. So it has to have the password sitting there, so it sticks it in RAM, right? And the password sits in RAM, waiting for the server to do its check. Okay, so that's something. Cookies are very similar. So a server, once a user authenticates, they type their password in. The server is going to remember who the user is by setting a cookie that represents them. We'll talk about cookies like I mentioned at the end of the lecture, so we'll go through fully how that works. But you can think of it as just almost like a password. And so the server needs to sort of keep that cookie around so that every time the user comes back and can say, oh yeah, that is the same user that is logged into this particular account. Okay, so the cookie value could be sitting there waiting to be checked against the cookie store, as it's called. And other things that could be there is private data. Maybe the user sent a bunch of data to the web server. And then the final thing is, what about that key? What about that SSL key, that session key between, in this particular case, between one particular user and the server? So if the server has 1,000 users connected, it will have 1,000 of these session keys sitting in RAM. And that's something it needs access to because it's constantly decrypting. Okay, so it's not like a key that you put in a safe. It's like a key that you have to have on hand because every time you send packets back and forth, you have to be able to do that decryption. And so those are exactly the kinds of things that would be sitting in RAM. And so with this particular exploit, Heartbleed, you could actually just hit a server that happened to be running OpenSSL in this configuration that had Heartbleed turned on, had the Heartbeat protocol turned on, and then you could pull out basically whatever's in their RAM. Okay, and so we saw lots of servers that were exploited. You could get, like I said, passwords, cookies, personally identifiable information. One website in Canada that was hacked was CRA, the Canada Revenue Agency, where you file your taxes. The hacker was able to get a whole bunch of people's tax returns that included their social insurance numbers and things like that. They were actually charged and I believe convicted. So that's a reminder that, this isn't, just because you can technically do something does not make it legal and certainly does not make it ethical. And so that's just a reminder that you can't just do this, even though technically you can do it. But anyways, now there was a final kind of thing that might be in the server's RAM that we kind of glossed over. We'll come back to it when we talk about server authentication. But there's an even like more important key. So as I mentioned, if you have 1,000 users connected to the website, you have 1,000 different session keys. So if I can grab your session key, it doesn't mean I can compromise someone else's account. But all of those session keys come from, there's this other secret key that's involved in signing, for example, a Diffie-Hellman exchange, a private key. And that's the key that if you could get that key, then you could actually break all of the session keys, or you could at least replace active sessions with sessions that you could intercept. Okay, so there is like this golden key that's in RAM that's used to derive all of these session keys. Let me put it that way. Okay, once again, glossing over the crypto details. And so if you get that key, then you could do real damage. Okay, and because that corresponds to something called a certificate, and certificates live for a couple of years, if you got that key, you could impersonate that server basically until they try and figure it out, and try and revoke that particular certificate. So there was this very damaging thing. Now, the problem with this key is it's like the very first thing that you put into RAM when you fire up SSL. Okay, and servers, they're meant to run, for a day, week, month. Every now and then you might have to shut it down to apply a software update, but they can run for months without rebooting. And so that key is like the very first thing that goes in RAM. And then, over the days and weeks that ensue, lots of other stuff fills up with RAM. And so even though you can grab 64 kilobytes, you could never grab enough data that went deep enough to actually pull out that particular key. At least that was the theory. And so there was even, if I recall correctly, I won't say the name of the company, but it was a large CDN, content distribution network service. And they actually had a sort of public challenge that said, this Heartbleed thing is really bad, but at least you can't steal this this private key for our certificate because in practice it's just not reachable by this attack. And so they sort of challenged the community, the hacker community, to try and do it on their servers. And so what the hackers did is they figured out, there's a way that we can actually do a denial of service attack on the server. We can cause it to reboot, and so they did that. They triggered the reboot, and then as soon as the server came back online, they hit it with Heartbleed. And because they did it quick enough, that was still within the window of the 64 kilobytes. That key was still in the window of the 64 kilobytes of data that they could pull off using Heartbleed, and they were able to get that session key. And then at that point, it was sort of universally recognized that, this attack is actually extremely, it was always very, very serious, but now it's like at a next level of seriousness. Okay. Now, OpenSSL, of course, quickly fixed it. It was all over the news. Like, this was like mainstream. You go to CBC and they are running articles on it. So it was a very high profile attack. And so I think everyone that had an OpenSSL server knew about it, and it was quickly fixed. And other people went around testing to see, even if you had a server and you didn't know that it was vulnerable, other people would be probing, like all the servers on the internet, looking for vulnerable servers, and then they could notify you that your server needed updating. So it was fixed relatively quickly. Okay, so let's go on to some other kinds of attacks. So another kind of attack you might have is also an attack that lets you break into the tunnel. And it's also an attack mostly on the implementation of the software. So crypto, even if you get the cryptography right, you copy it out of the textbook exactly, and it, mathematically it does what an encryption algorithm is doing, you still have to code it up. And when you code it up, you might do things that leave it vulnerable. Okay, and so one set of vulnerabilities, a big class of vulnerabilities, are called side channel analysis. And in this case, what you do is you try to use things that people aren't really thinking about. They're just thinking about whether they got the algorithm correctly. They're not thinking about other particular issues. And the one that was pretty effective against, once again, this is going back some time, but against earlier implementations of SSL was something called timing attacks. And so the idea here is that a server has a secret key and they're using it. And depending on the exact value of the secret key, the algorithms that they're running may take more or less time. Okay, so they're doing a certain number of steps, and the number of steps that they have to do is a result of exactly what that value of the key is. And so if they take a long time to do something, or if they take a short time to do something, you can start to infer what kinds of values they might have for that key. And so this is a lot more complicated than I made it sound, okay? And usually you have to do, thousands of queries against a server in order to try and read that particular key value. And you might never get the full key, but you can get enough of the key that then you can use exhaustive search to finish off the search for the exact right key. But anyway, so OpenSSL, actually, so I said something bad about it. Now let me say something positive about it. They put a lot of work into making sure that all the algorithms in OpenSSL don't have timing attacks that are applicable to them. So everything is what they call constant time. So anytime an algorithm depends on a secret, it always runs in the exact same amount of time. Now, there are ways to look for really tiny windows of timing attacks. Like if you take in the crypto course, you know that sometimes you encrypt and then you MAC, and there's some padding that's involved, and there's some confusion about where the padding goes, like is it inside the MAC or outside the MAC? And so little things like that can result in ciphertexts that are just one block bigger than the other or one block smaller than the other. And you can actually use that to exploit. If you run enough trials, you can actually use that kind of thing to do a sort of an exploit of SSL, either to get some partial decryptions, or in some cases, you could also try to attack the key itself and try and recover the key. So there were some early attacks on, not on the session key that protects it, but it was on this higher level certificate key. In particular, the RSA implementation was vulnerable. And then more recently, there was the Lucky 13 attack, which was the one on Max that I was just describing. Those details don't matter, but I just want to give you the flavor that side channels are very important. Now, there's more side channels than timing, so you can look at how long something takes in terms of time. And also, side channels don't just apply to crypto. They can apply to lots of other kinds of things. So some other examples would be, for example, let's say you have an ATM, like a bank machine, okay? And people walk up, they put their PIN into the bank machine, and then they take their money out, and you want to know what their PINs are. Now, of course, you've seen things like with cameras and things like that, but there's some other attacks. So these worked like 30 years ago. They don't work today, but 30 years ago, things that you could do were, well, if you could get to where the ATM was plugged in, and you could put a meter there so you can measure the power, what you would see is that, when someone pressed the key that was number 3 on their PIN, the amount, there would be like a little voltage spike or drop or something like that. And when they press the 5 key, you would also see that, they pressed the key, but the shape of the voltage spike would be slightly different. Okay. And a 7 would look slightly different. And you have to do really, really, fine-grained measurements. But what you could do is you could actually read out what keys were being pressed based on sort of the shape of the electricity that was being consumed in order to allow that key to be pressed. Similarly, they often would emit electromagnetic, it would cause electromagnetic interference. And so if you had a very sensitive radio, sometimes, in these very early machines, you could hear on the radio which key was being pressed, and it would have a slightly different frequency. And so you could read the key off based on that. There were also attacks on computers that just acoustically. So this is something too that's largely been solved, I would say. But if you use computers 10, 20 years ago, you might remember that computers are pretty noisy. And maybe if you have a desktop computer or something like that, you still might be able to hear some acoustic noise. Like there's some clicking and hissing and staticky like kind of sounds that come from it. Well, it turns out that those are all sort of results of how much memory you're using and how fast you're running the processor. And like there's physical explanations for where those sounds are coming from. And the physical phenomena is being driven by what you're asking the software to do. And so if you're asking it to encrypt something, depending on exactly the algorithm that you're using. It's doing something intensive and then not so intensive and then intensive, and it kind of bounces back and forth. And you can actually read out those periods of intensive activity, and that tells you something about the cryptographic key in certain kinds of algorithms. So you could read out keys actually by just listening essentially to the computer. Keyboards also. So when you press, this is also an acoustic thing, when you press the Q key as opposed to the F key as opposed to the B key, it makes a slightly different sound, right? They all click, but that click sounds slightly different. And so if you had a very sensitive microphone in a room, you could actually maybe tell what people were typing into their computer from their keyboard, because you knew the differences in those clicking sounds. So that's, anyway, so that whole thing is called side channel analysis. It's very interesting from a security perspective because it involves a lot of things that you don't think about initially, and it's a very practical source of attacks as well. So SSL had some, TLS had some vulnerabilities to that. Okay, downgrades we'll circle back to. So as I said, before you set up the tunnel, you have to agree what the tunnel is going to look like. And you don't have the tunnel in place to make that agreement. So you have to do that agreement before you have the tunnel in place. And so generally you do this optimistically. You just hope that the server gets the right information. And if it gets changed, then once the tunnel's set up, you circle back and you check and you make sure that the values were right. And if they aren't right, then you drop the connection and you retry. So what is negotiated in HTTPS? And so there's a whole bunch of things. First off, the version. So you might choose to use TLS 1.3. So that would be the first thing that you negotiate. Then within each version, there's a whole bunch of different crypto algorithms that are supported. Everything from how you're going to do the key exchange, which involves public key crypto, to how you're going to do the actual bulk encryption, which involves symmetric key encryption. And so I won't go through all those details, but you can negotiate all of those things. They're called cipher suites. So you can negotiate what cipher suites you're going to use. And then there might be some other smaller parameters that are negotiable as well. And so what you could do is you could try to downgrade that particular attack, or sorry, downgrade either the crypto that was used or the version that was used, or some combination of both of them. Now, because SSL, they actually had a stroke of brilliance, which is they never let you negotiate something that would affect the integrity of the channel. It would only affect the confidentiality of the channel. And so as a result, the integrity was usually pretty good. So that check where you circle back to see whether the values you received were the values that were sent, that check basically was never sort of compromisable. There wasn't a cipher suite that you could choose that would compromise that particular check. And so anyways, they avoided this could have been a much bigger problem than it was. But there are ways anyways to downgrade that usually exploit how it's implemented in software. And so anyways, there's one example of an attack called Freak. You can read about it if you want. I'm not going to cover it in detail. I just want to include some of these things in case you're interested. Maybe you want to do a project on it, or just for your own interest, you want to research some of these things. Yeah, and so Freak, I'll say maybe, yeah. So there was some, okay, so the worst cipher suites, first off, there's actually what's called the Null Cipher, which is you can actually ask for an encryption where there's no encryption at all. Right, so you can get a TLS connection and just say, hey, actually, I don't want encryption. Now, you still get integrity on that channel, so it's still better than not using anything at all. And almost no one used it, and I think it was depreciated very quickly. I don't think it made it into even SSL 3.0. I forget exactly, but it's yeah. So that was an early one. Another interesting thing is that when public key cryptography, and actually just cryptography in general, started to be invented in the 1970s. So 77 was when one big algorithm came out. But in the 1970s, academics got involved in and companies got involved in trying to standardize encryption. Before that, there was encryption. I didn't mean to imply that it was invented in the 70s. There was been encryption for a long time, but it was usually used by the military. And so the military actually viewed encryption not as a technology for the general public. It was almost like a military technology. It was a munition. It would be classified the same way that you would classify bombs and certain kinds of guns and things like that. And so there was that attitude in the first couple decades of people working on cryptography that these are actually military grade secrets, and that you can't just write software and put whatever encryption algorithm you want in it. And so what would happen is in the US, they had very strict laws and very concrete laws. So they actually said, this is how big your key can be. Okay. If it's any bigger than this, then you're not allowed. You can use it if you're an American, within the US. That's fine. But you can't give that to somebody who's from the outside of the US, because we don't want, the certain nations that we are at war with, we don't want them to have encryption technology. And so there was this concept of building browsers which implemented HTTPS. And so there would be two versions of the browser. There would be the browser that Americans could use, and then there would be the version called the export version. And the export version would just have very weak cryptography. And the way the values were chosen, basically it was thought that the NSA, which is the agency that's involved in signal communication interception in the US, that they would be able to break the export level of crypto, so it wouldn't get beyond that. And so, for example, RSA 512-bit RSA is an example of something that was allowed to be exported. And so that was something that was supported in early versions of SSL. And it's still kicking around in implementations, both on the server side and on the client side. And so Freak was some tricks. They played some tricks in order to actually get the connections downgraded to this export version of RSA. And then you could just break it very, very easily, even with just a normal laptop computer. It's really weak now, like 30 years later. Now, for your interest, those export laws were changed. So Bill Clinton changed them in the 90s, and so that no longer is applicable. So now you can use strong encryption and you can export it, and there's no limitations. It's not considered a military secret anymore. Okay, so the next thing I'll do is we'll talk about how you might decrypt pieces of a message, even if you couldn't encrypt the whole thing, and in particular if you don't have the key itself. So you don't know the session key, and you're not going to try and get it. And so I'm going to give you an example, which is called crime. And this is actually only one example of a bunch of, there's a bunch of attacks that use the same general principle. Or the setup of the attack anyway is the same. But crime's easy to understand. It uses compression, which most of you should know, generally speaking, what compression is. It's basically shrinking data down so it's smaller. Okay, and anyways, what's sort of complicated about this is the sort of scenario that gets you in the place that you can do these kinds of attacks. So I have a little picture here, and I'm just going to walk through it. So we're going to start with Alice. So Alice is sitting on her computer, and she opens up a website. Okay, and within her website, somehow the adversary is able to get some JavaScript on the website that Alice is looking at. So either the Alice directly browsed to the adversary's website, or she browsed somewhere where maybe there was an ad and the adversary was providing the ad. Who knows? Okay, so the adversary somehow gets Alice on a site, and the adversary has this JavaScript. Okay, and in general, the internet there shouldn't be a problem. Okay, ideally you don't want the adversary running JavaScript on the websites that you look at, but you would expect that there were certain protections put in place so that wouldn't be too damaging if you ever found yourself in that scenario, especially since you don't know who anyone is on the internet generally, and you go to all sorts of different websites. And so at the end of this course, we'll talk a lot about the browser model and something called the same origin policy and how this is kind of dealt with. But that's not relevant to what we need. Okay. Now, what will happen is the adversary, once they have JavaScript running, they can open a connection to any website they want. Okay. And once again, this generally shouldn't be problematic for Alice. And Alice doesn't even know that it's happening. Okay, so they might send a request. So rec here stands for request. So they'll send a request off to Google. Okay, they'll just request some data, and or they'll just ping Google and say, hey, are you there, or something like that. Okay, now what happens is if Alice happens to be logged into the website Google and she said, always keep me signed in, then when this request goes to Google, Google wants to know that it's coming from Alice, because then it doesn't have to ask Alice to log in to the website. Okay, and so there's this thing called cookies. Once again, we're not going to focus too much on the details here, but there are these things called cookies, and we're going to circle back to them later in this course. But what you should know is that Alice's browser will see that this packet, this request, is going to google.com. Alice will check, her browser will check, hey, do I have any cookies for google.com? She'll see, oh yeah, I have this cookie because Alice is logged in. And so it will just staple this cookie onto the front of this request. Okay, so this whole thing will go over to Google, and then Google will respond. And maybe the adversary's JavaScript doesn't even display the fact that it responded to Alice. So Alice doesn't even necessarily know that this is happening. Okay, now the good news is that this is all encrypted. Okay, so Google might be set up that it doesn't even accept cookies if they're not encrypted. So even if Alice tries to send a non-encrypted request to Google, Google set their cookies so that they only get transported when there's a secure connection. And so that's possible. And so the good news is this is encrypted. So even if the adversary, right, is on the line and Eve happens to see this packet go by, she can't do anything about it because it's encrypted. Okay, and generally the level of encryption is something we call IND-CCA2. If you've taken crypto, you'll know what that means. If you haven't, don't worry about it. But generally that's sort of the highest level of encryption. And if you can achieve this kind of level of encryption, then most of these attacks just go away. Okay, unless if you have some exploit of the software, they actually all go away. But in this particular case, it wasn't achieving this highest level of security. Okay, so the request goes over. It's encrypted, and then the response comes back. Okay, now the next thing is that generally speaking, TLS or HTTPS, let's put it at that level, it doesn't do any compression of the data. So it just sends the raw bytes over to Google, and then it gets it back. But there are some versions of TLS. There's a sort of parallel version, which is called DTLS, which is used for websites that go over UDP as opposed to TCP. So usually when you go to a web server, you're using something called TCP. But if you're watching a movie and it's streaming to you on Netflix, for example, in that particular case, it may be coming to you over UDP. And so UDP is sort of like if packets get lost, we don't care. In TCP, if packets get lost, you give them back, and usually your browser won't display it until it's received everything. So if you're on a website and you're kind of waiting for it to load, usually there's other reasons for that, but it could possibly be that maybe a packet got dropped and then it has to re-request it, and then only when it gets that packet then it actually displays the page to you. Usually with a movie, by the time you realize that something's missing, and you go back to the server and you ask for it, well, that you've moved past that in the video, right? So the video will get fuzzy for a second, and then it will just carry on, and you won't even bother asking for those dropped packets. Okay, so that's UDP. So UDP also happens to use compression, or it can use compression. There was also some experiments. So there was a protocol called SPDY, SPDY, that was meant to replace more than HTTPS. It was a whole chunk of the network stack. It was an experiment, and now I think it's been depreciated. But anyways, it also used compression. Okay, and so the idea is that it's not used very commonly, but there are a few corner cases where compression might be applied to this packet before it's sent to Google. Okay, and so it turns out that that's enough to do some damage. Okay, and so what happens is because the adversary is running the JavaScript, what they're actually requesting from Google, they're choosing it. Okay, so they can put any value they want in this field. okay? And they can't see what's in the cookie because the browser is putting this. So the browser puts a value here. The adversary puts a value here. Both of the values get compressed together. They both get encrypted together by the browser. So the browser does both of those. And then it gets sent to Google, and then Eve can see the end result, okay? So she knows what the request was, but she doesn't know what the cookie was. She didn't see the compression happen. She didn't see the encryption happen. She just sees the end result. Okay, so how do we exploit this? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to try and guess the cookie. Okay, now there's a whole bunch of data that's involved here, but we're just going to simplify it and pretend that like the cookie is literally the only thing that's in the first part of this packet. Okay, so you have a cookie that's sitting there, A, B, C, D, E, F. It's usually random looking because cookies are kind of like keys. They're meant to be secret. And so it's usually random. And one law that we know from compression is if you compress random data, it doesn't compress. Okay, so you need to have some repetition in the data, things that look a lot like if there's a picture and there's a whole bunch of black pixels that are all together, you can compress that. Okay, but if it's random, it's very hard to compress. So if your cookie is whatever 16 bytes long, then when you compress it, it's probably 16 bytes long as well. Okay, now imagine that what the adversary here is going to do is she's going to guess the cookie, and she'll do it at random as well. So she'll just guess a random value. Okay, so the cookie itself, and she'll know that because she has her own Google account, so she knows that cookie's 16 bytes, but she doesn't know Alice's particular value. And so what she'll do is she'll put a guess in for what she thinks Alice's cookie is. Okay, and if Alice's cookie is 16 bytes and Eve's guess is also 16 bytes and it's random, then when you compress it, it's not going to actually compress, and so you'll see 32 bytes. Then it's going to get encrypted, and depending on the encryption that's used, but there's this thing called a stream cipher where you encrypt it basically byte by byte. Eve might notice that, oh, hey, the end result, right? The end result is 32 bytes, okay? And so what she knows is she knows that it didn't compress very well, okay? Now, let's say, conversely, that Eve guessed the cookie exactly correct, okay? If you have two copies of the exact same value, how well does that compress? And the answer is that compresses very well. That's like having a bunch of black pixels that are all together that are all the same color. Okay, you have two copies of the exact same value. So instead of sending two copies of the same value, the browser will just say, oh, take this value and double it, right? And then now you know what's there. And so you can say that in a lot less than 32 bytes. Okay, and so that compresses very well. And so what Eve will see is she'll see, oh, this packet just went by and it was really small. Okay, therefore I think either my guess was right or I'm getting close to right. Okay, like there must be a lot of bytes that are common between the two. Okay, and so if you do this enough, you can either get the cookie exactly or you can get close enough to the cookie that you can finish the attack off by exhaustive search. Okay, and so this exploited the fact that compression was used. It had this sort of weird setup where the adversary is running JavaScript and you're trying to steal cookies. And note, you're not decrypting everything. Okay, the other thing about cookie is it's pretty small. So if you're trying to decrypt something that was, like say the length of a cryptographic key, 256 bits, you couldn't guess 2 to the 256 possible values. Like that's too many values. That's more than the number of atoms in the universe. Like that's just a huge number. So there's no way that you can do this particular attack. Okay. But if a cookie, if it's small enough, then maybe you could. And because as you get closer, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller, you're actually getting partial information, even if you're sort of partially right. You don't have to hit it on the nose. And then all of a sudden it clicks and says you're right. And then for everything else, it says it's wrong. You can kind of get closer and closer to the right value as well. Okay. So this works because encryption preserves the length of the data itself. And stream ciphers are even better. They leak more about it. But if it's a block cipher, it rounds up to the nearest block size. And the idea is that you can, in this case, you append your guess, and then if it's right or if it's close to being right, then it compresses well, and if it's way off, then it doesn't compress so well. Okay, and so there are a bunch of other attacks that use this kind of setup. Okay, so there was Beast, and it was actually it didn't use compression. Okay, so it used the same setup of the adversary having JavaScript, and you're trying to guess values, but it used the problem with something called initialization vectors in block ciphers. So they weren't done right in earlier versions of TLS since fixed, and so that exploited it. There was Lucky 13, which we mentioned before as a timing attack. I think we mentioned it before. It was a timing attack, but then instead of using it to steal keys, you used it in this kind of setup to try and attack a cookie. There's also ways to sort of slide where the cookie is around, and it allows you to sort of try and attack the cookie like 2 bytes at a time. So there are a lot of there's a lot of technical details that I'm glossing over that let you do this attack a little bit better. Another thing, RC4 you might recognize as stream cipher. Turns out that RC4 is an example I mentioned earlier where the encryption wasn't perfect. So when you encrypted values, the values wouldn't come out looking perfectly random. So there were certain bit positions where you could just look at the ciphertext, and based on whether it was a 1 or 0, you might know that, oh, there's an 80% chance that the bit that was in that position that's trying to be encrypted was a 0 as opposed to a 1. Okay, and so what you would do is you'd have to do like 10,000. You'd have to ask for the encryption of the same thing 10,000 times. But then if you looked at that bit position, you could make a good guess as to what was in that particular position. And then you could either add data in front of where the cookie is or not add data. You could choose the amount of data to appear before where the cookie ends up getting inserted by the browser. And then you could kind of slide the cookie around so that you could have the different positions, the different values inside the cookie always in that position in the ciphertext that you could look at to try and decrypt. Okay, so these are a lot of details that I'm throwing out that I'm not going to test you on. This is just sort of for completeness. And then there's Poodle. That's another attack. Maybe in the interest of time, we'll just move on. So you can look up these attacks if you're interested in them, and you can learn a little bit more about them. Okay, so I updated the attack tree so you can find the PDF on the Moodle website, and then you can see how these all kind of fit into it. And anyways, that's all I want to say about this second category, or sorry, the first category of break into the tunnel. Okay, so we've talked about inspect from outside. We've talked about breaking into the tunnel. Now what we'll do is we'll spend a little time introducing the problems with how you basically tell where the tunnel ends. Okay, so the key question is, you're Alice, you do see that you have this tunnel and you don't know where it ends. Okay, and so the first question I would have for you is, technically, at a technical level, what is it that defines, what does it mean? What does the tunnel ending mean? What defines the end of a tunnel? Is it an IP address? Is it the name of a server? Is it the name of an individual? What is it that actually sort of defines the end of the tunnel? Okay, and because this tunnel is cryptographic, okay, so there is a network protocol that gets run, but the tunnel itself is a cryptographic tunnel. And that's inside of a network protocol. So the network protocol can get you talking to a particular server or IP address or something like that. But whether the tunnel ends there, note that the network protocol will also route the tunnel through a whole bunch of people in the middle. Okay, and these people can't break into the tunnel unless if they use one of the exploits that we talked about. But generally speaking, they're not going to be able to break into the tunnel. And so what's special about the person that's at the true end of the tunnel that lets them, stop the tunnel as opposed to anybody else? Okay. And so the answer is, there's a key. Okay. Now this is slightly different than the key that we talked about before, the symmetric key, that's between these two parties. Okay. That also, that lets, people who, I don't know how best to describe it. It lets you, when you put messages into the tunnel, It lets you decrypt them when they come out at the other end. Okay, but before you start encrypting and decrypting messages, what you do is you try to figure out who the person is that is going to have the key that's going to be able to decrypt these messages. Another way of putting it is, in order to get that key that lets you encrypt and decrypt messages, you have to use some other cryptography to basically get that key. That key comes from another key. Okay, and so keys come from keys, and it's complicated, but that's sort of how TLS works. And so at the end of the day, there's one key that's like the master key. Okay, the master key is the key that this server uses for all of its connections. It's not specific to its connection to Alice. It just uses it generally across the board. And there's this part of cryptography called public key cryptography, where you can actually publish a key that's public, and anyone can use that key to encrypt messages to you, or they can check whether, if you signed a message, whether the signature corresponds to the person who put up that public key. Okay, so you keep your secret key secret, and you put up this public key, and then anybody on the internet, whether they know you or not, they can take that public key and they can either encrypt messages for you, or they can verify things that you've signed. And usually you have different keys for those two purposes. Okay, so that's called a public key, and that's the thing that really defines where the tunnel ends. Okay, if the tunnel ends at the person who controls that public key. And by controls, I mean they have the private key that can either sign messages or decrypt messages corresponding to the public key. Now, for simplicity, I'm going to talk about signatures only because that's actually what's used now. So the public key is a key that lets people tell that it was actually you that signed the message. And then you have your secret signing key that you can use to sign messages. Okay, so the tunnel ends with the person who knows the secret signing key. That sort of defines the end of the tunnel. Okay, so you want to tunnel to Google. Okay, all you need to know is what is Google's public key. That's it. It's that simple. If you can know what the public key of Google is, then you can form a tunnel that will end at Google, and you can be confident that that tunnel ends at Google. Okay, so the endpoint of the tunnel is a public key. And the new problem we have is, the only problem that we have to solve, okay, is how do we know, if Google says this is my public key, or conversely, someone comes along and says Google's public key is blah, 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 blah. How do you know that that's actually Google's public key? Okay, if you can solve that problem, then this whole space of subverting server authentication just goes away. Okay, you've solved this. There's no way to subvert server authentication. Okay, what subverting server authentication means is somehow the adversary is able to convince you that their key, that their signing key, or their public key is Google's public key. So the adversary will come along and say, "Oh no, that's not Google's public key. Google's public key is actually this, and it's the adversary's key." Okay, if the adversary can convince you of that, then they are able to subvert server authentication. Okay, so all we need is some sort of, telephone book where we can look up what Google's public key is. And if we could do that, this whole SSL thing would work great. HTTPS would work fantastically. The problem is we can't have such a textbook. And there's certain reasons why it's the case, or not a textbook, but a phone book. We can't have that type of thing. The first thing is who would produce it, because whoever produced it, you're trusting them. And secondly, servers change their keys every so often. And so every time, then you would have to have a procedure to update it. But then if Google went to the person who made the phone book and said, I want to change my key, how does the person who makes the phone book know that that's actually Google, right? How do they know it's not the adversary pretending to be Google saying that they want to change their key because they want to put in the adversary's key instead of Google? So that whole type of thing requires more thought anyways, okay? So very simple. If we can figure out who the public key belongs to, then we can solve this particular problem, okay? So we're not going to use a phone book, okay? So what is it that we're going to use? Do we have anything that's sort of available to us in order to use? And one thing that you've probably heard about, and maybe you're even thinking it in your head, is you're thinking, oh, it's certificates, right? And you're right, okay? Certificates are kind of involved in this process. So I know it's Google because I see their certificate. Okay, so let's talk about what a certificate is, and then we'll talk about whether it actually solves this problem or not. Okay, so the next thing is, so here's a certificate, and this is basically what it consists of. So basically it will have an identity, so we'll call that Google in this case, and there's a little thing that we'll talk about, I think, in the next lecture, or maybe the lecture after, which is we're not actually trying to authenticate Google, the company, and Mountain View. Okay, what we're trying to authenticate is just the server that responds to requests that are sent to the domain google.ca. So this isn't saying that this is Google, the company. Okay, we haven't completed that, so we don't know. We don't know that this is that company's public key. We just know that it's the server that is sitting at google.ca. Okay, and if you want the company there, there's something called EV certificates, and we'll cover all of that. So we'll circle back to that issue later, but for now we'll consider these things. They're called domain validated certificates. Okay, so basically a certificate, it's a list of information, and there's a bunch of stuff that's in a certificate. I'll show you an example in a second. But the key things are, this is the identity of the person, or the server in this case, and this is their public key. Okay, so there's a document, it says this, and then somebody's going to sign this document, and they're going to say, yeah, we checked, and that's actually google.ca's certificate. Okay, so it's kind of like these are the people that are producing the phone book, if you will. Okay, and so these are called certificate authorities, and the way that we create this object is they do a digital signature. Okay, and so they sign on top of all of this data. So once they sign it, you can't change any of this data. Like say you flip that B to a C, then the signature would no longer be valid. So that's the properties of digital signatures. Okay. Now, how do you check a signature? What you do is you have to get the certificate authority's public key, and then you check whether it matches this particular certificate. Okay. Now, notice what I just said. You might be nodding along. Yeah, that makes sense. What did I just say? I just said you have to get the certificate authority's public key. Well, wait a minute. Isn't that the exact same problem that we had? We were trying to figure out what Google's public key is, and we didn't have a way of doing. We couldn't actually figure out what Google's public key is. So we introduced this idea of a certificate that's signed by a certificate authority, but it requires me to know the certificate authority's public key. So how am I going to do that? I mean, if I have a way to know what the certificate authority's public key is, then I should just use that mechanism to figure out what Google's public key is, right? And the second question you might have is, well, I also said that the certificate authority confirmed that this is Google's public key. How did the certificate authority do that? How did the CA figure out that this was Google's public key? And if they were able to figure out, why can't I? Okay, so this certificate, and this is really important to understand, it totally doesn't solve the problem at all. We actually made zero progress on this problem. All we did is we pushed it. We said, I can't figure out what Google's public key is, so let's use this other thing over on the side where I have to figure out what a CA's public key is, and the CA has to figure out what Google's public key is. That actually sounds worse. Because there's two people who have to figure out who each other's public keys are, as opposed to me just figuring out what Google's public key is. Okay, so all we've done really is push this problem around. Okay, so in summary, the two issues are, one, how does Alice know the public key used to sign the certificate actually belongs to the CA? Okay, and this is basically a copy of the original problem of how does Alice know that it's Google's public key that is setting up this tunnel. It seems that if you could answer the first question, you could answer the second question. Okay. The next thing is, how did the CA figure out it was Google's public key before it signed the certificate, right? And if I'm Alice, why can't I just do what the CA did? And then we don't need these certificate authorities at all, right? They can all just go away. Okay. Now it turns out that there are answers to these two questions, and they might not be fully satisfactory answers. There's a lot of criticism of how this whole model works. And when you have keys signing other keys and things like that, we sometimes call that whole thing public key infrastructure, or PKI. And so the whole PKI of the web, there's a lot of criticism of how it works. But anyways, that's fine. Okay, so let's try and answer these one at a time. And then, as you'll see, there's a lot of detail and nuance in this. Okay, so let's start with the first one. How does Alice know the certificate's public key? Okay, and so the answer to this is that it's actually inside of her computer. And even if Alice goes to the Apple store, she buys a brand new MacBook Air, and she's never turned it on. It's never been connected to the internet. It's sealed. It's in the box. She opens the box, takes it out, turns it on. Before it even goes on the internet, there are certificates that are literally hard-coded into that computer. Okay, so that's where you get the key from the CA, and it's put there by Apple. Okay, so Apple somehow figured out, these CA's public keys, probably through like in-person meetings and things like that, and these keys are really long-lived. These keys they don't change except for every like 30 years or something like that. Okay, and so Apple will put these keys, they're called root certificates, and it will put them into the operating system. Okay, and same with Windows and other things as well. And sometimes when you download a browser like Firefox, it might come with its own set of certificates, but generally most browsers will just use whatever the operating system comes with. Okay, and so you can actually see them if you want. So for example, on Apple, they're under something called Keychain, so I'll show them to you. And one thing you might think about before I show this is, okay, how many certificate authorities are there? Right? Like Apple has to personally verify them and things like that. And, who are they? Are they like, is it like Google and Facebook? Like who are these entities, and sort of how many are there? So think about the answers to that, and then I'll show you what the answers look like. So I'm going to go into system roots, and then I'm going to go to certificates. And so you can see here's some certificates. Okay. And you recognize some of these names, probably like Amazon and Apple, certainly. And then you see, first off, one thing that hopefully you have an impression of is there's actually a lot. Like this looks like a lot. Like we're only at C or D, and we can keep going. Keep going, and oh, there we hit the end. Okay. Now, some of these companies have more than one root certificate, so the list looks a little longer than it is. And it turns out that some of these companies are owned by other companies in the list and things like that. But one impression you might have is, wow, this is actually a lot. There's a lot of companies out there that have these root certificates in your computer. And then the other thing is, even though we saw Amazon and Apple at the top, I think that if you look through this, unless if you're an expert in this area, you probably don't know any of these companies. Right, like OpenTrust, OISTE, Network Solutions, maybe you've heard of NetLock, Microsec, Kissa. What are all of these companies, right? And so anyway, so that's hopefully the impression that you get. And so it turns out that I sort of copy and pasted this into the notes, and so it seems like there's about 50-ish companies once you sort of collapse companies into other companies that are owned by them, and you don't really know who a lot of these companies are. Okay, and so this might actually be a trust issue. In fact, there has been a lot of criticism that this CA store, as it's called, has gotten too big over the past years, and it's been hard for Apple, if a new company comes along and says, hey, I want to be a system root, I want to provide root certificates, right? You gave it to these other 50 companies, why won't you give it to me? Right. And so anyway, so the idea of having a lot of these companies turns out to be a little bit problematic, but then it actually gets worse. Okay. So let me show you why it gets worse. So let's actually just go to a couple websites. So we'll start at Concordia, and if you want to see what certificate looks like, by the way, you just click the lock. and then you go show certificate on Apple. And so most browsers will have this is Apple Safari, I should say. And most browsers will have their own implementation. And before I show you what's up top here, let's look at the certificate itself. So this is Concordia certificate. And so you can see it has a little more information than just the name of Concordia, concordia.ca, and the actual key itself, which will be down here. Okay, so here's the key. And so you can see there's all sorts of other things. There is some information about the company itself. Whether this is actually validated or not, that's going to depend on who issued it. This is called it's called organization validation, and so in this case, the CA that signed off on it is someone called Global Sign, and they're attesting that they did validate some of this information. And then you can see all sorts of crypto details. And if you take 6110, you'll be able to understand. You should actually understand what all of these fields mean. And then there's some other stuff down here. We'll talk about a bit about some of these things, like basic constraints are important, and we'll come back to them. CRL distribution points we'll come back to. Yeah. Okay, so anyway, so that's what a certificate looks like. Now, the thing that I want to show you is, okay, who signed this certificate, right? And so it turns out that Concordia's certificate was signed by a CA called Global Sign, but Global Sign, you see that there's this like kind of chain of certificates, and it seems like this was actually signed by the root CA, okay? So that's not an accident. What's happening is this root CA, this certificate here, is the one that was hard baked into my computer when I bought it. And instead of Concordia getting their certificate from the root certificate, what Concordia was able to do is they were able to get their certificate by it was signed by a different certificate, and this certificate was signed by the root certificate. Okay, so there was some sort of intermediate certificate that was used. It wasn't directly signed by the root certificate. It was signed by some other certificate. Okay, and so with SSL certificates, you are able to delegate certificates. So you're able to form these chains, or a root certificate is able to say, hey, I authorize this certificate to do everything that I can do. Okay. Now, it turns out that Global Sign owns both of these certificates, and so it's virtually the same thing. It's just a technical distinction that the exact certificate that's being signed isn't the root certificate. It's another certificate that the same company owns. Big deal, right? Well, it's not always the case, okay? So, for example, if we go to Google, you'll see that in this case, Google was signed by something called GTS, which is Google Trust System, and that is itself... Google Trust Services. That's actually Google's own middle certificate, okay? And then this certificate was signed by Global Sign, which is not Google, okay? So there was a root company, there was a root certificate, it was a company, and they gave Google the ability to issue any certificates it wanted, and then Google issued themselves a certificate, okay? So these intermediates are not always different companies, okay? So a third example that shows this is Wikipedia. And here what you'll see is that there are actually three completely different companies. So Wikipedia was signed by Let's Encrypt, which is actually a really cool project. And if you have some time, I strongly recommend looking into that project because it's really cool. But anyways, Wikipedia was signed by something called Let's Encrypt. And Let's Encrypt was signed by DST, and DST is not Let's Encrypt. Okay, so Wikipedia is their own company, Let's Encrypt's their own company, and DST is their own company. So they're all three different companies. And when DST says, hey, Let's Encrypt, you can have this, what we call CA certificate, Let's Encrypt can actually take that certificate and issue a certificate for any website on the internet. Okay, and so having this intermediate certificate is basically as powerful as having the root certificate. There's almost no difference between them. It's maybe a little easier to get rid of this if you wanted to than in order to get rid of this. But other than that, it's basically, this is as powerful as having a root certificate itself. Okay, So what that means is, even though we said that, oh, there's 50 companies that have root certificates, and that sounds like a lot, there could be more than 50 companies that have the power of a root certificate, but you're just not seeing them because they're in this intermediate step. Okay. So let's go back here. And so just to show you how this works. So this is, for example, let's start at the site. So you have a website, and so it's Google, and here's Google's public key. And then this is signed by some CA prime prime. Okay. And CA prime prime has its own certificate that says, hi, I'm CA prime prime. This is my public key. And that's signed by another CA prime. And CA prime has its own certificate that says, I'm CA prime, and this is my public key. And then that was signed by an actual root certificate. Okay. And the root certificates just sign themselves. Okay. They're hard baked into the operating system, so they don't need someone else to sign for them. So it's a self-signed certificate. Okay. And so we said there's 50 of these certificates in the root store, roughly 50 companies, I should say, that correspond to all these certificates that we saw. But since these companies can authorize other companies to issue certificates, there's way more than 50 people that have the same permission as a root certificate. So these are called intermediate certificates, or intermediary or subsidiary certificates. There's different names for them. And so they're here. Okay, in the middle. Now, notice that your root certificates, you can go in your computer and you can look them up. But your intermediate certificates, you don't see those until you actually connect to a website. You take the time to look at its certificate, and you notice who that middle company is. Okay, so these are not written down everywhere. There's no list of where all of these things are. Now that is kind of changing. There is a project called Certificate Transparency that's aiming to write down all of these things, but we'll set that aside for a second. And so generally speaking, there's no way. Not every certificate's in Certificate Transparency. That's why I say generally speaking. So generally speaking, there's no way to see, how many of these are, what the companies are, or anything like that. Okay, there is one way to tell. And so the way that you find these is actually by going to every single website on the internet. And so it turns out that you can do that relatively quickly. It doesn't take as long as you might think. How do you find every website? Like, you can't try every domain name. No, you do it by IP address. So the number of all possible IP addresses is not that big. And so you could actually literally scan the whole internet. There's a tool called ZMap that came out recently that is very good and efficient way of doing that. And so you could actually try and ping every single website. You could write down what their certificates are, and then people did this. So people use ZMap to do it. There was a Firefox extension for a while from an organization called the EFF that wrote down these certificates. There was that project I mentioned, Certificate Transparency. They also they have all the EV certificates, and now it's being expanded. But anyway, so there are different people who have done this, but you have to kind of measure the entire internet to see how many of these intermediate certificates there are. And when you look, you see that, it's not just 50 companies, there's something like between 200 and 600 entities. So there's different numbers, different measurements have different numbers. And then when you go inside and you look at the companies, some of them are kind of weird, like Ford Motor Company. I don't know if this is true today, but at least as of a few years ago, Ford had an intermediate certificate. Marks and Spencer, which is like a clothing line more in the UK than here in Canada, they had one. Department of Homeland Security, which is a branch of the United States government, they had a certificate. Okay, and so you have 50 of these root certificates, and you have maybe 600 of these intermediate certificates, and they're invisible, and you don't see them until you actually connect through one of them. Okay, so why is this a big deal? Who cares? There's a lot of these companies. Well, this is the key point. Any certificate authority, any one of these 50 or any one of these 200 to 600 entities, they can sign a certificate for any website on the internet. Okay, and your browser will accept that as a valid certificate. So if I'm an attacker, I'm looking to see, hey, Ford has this certificate. I wonder if somehow I could get access to it, or if I could get Ford to make me a fake Facebook certificate. If I have a fake Facebook certificate, it's super weird that it's coming from Ford, right? But nobody knows that. Your computer, like, nobody's looking at the certificates, right? Your computer just connects. And when you connect, the very first thing you do is you send your cookie. And so even if I did notice it, it's too late. My cookie's gone, right? Or I type my password in, right? And so so even if people noticed, it's sort of too late. You could steal a lot of information that way, okay? And so any one of these CAs, if any one of them gets hacked or breached, then you can forge whatever certificates you want, okay? And so this has happened in real life. So there have been some real life examples of these intermediary certificate authorities that got breached, and adversaries were able to mint certificates for Google and Facebook and things like that, and then they use them in the wild. And we don't know how often this happens, but 2 attacks were detected. Actually, so Google, it's interesting. So Google, you know them as the search engine. So they own one of the most popular websites on the internet. And they also run a browser, Chrome. So because they're sort of, if you go back to the actual original diagram, Alice she's not like a human dropping messages in this tunnel, right? It's her browser that's doing it. And they also own an operating system too, right? So maybe her browser, maybe her operating system is going in. And so Google owns a very popular browser called Chrome. They own a very popular mobile operating system called Android. They also have Chrome OS, which is maybe not so popular. And then they also happen to own the most popular website on the whole internet. And so they're actually in a nice position of power, because if Chrome or Android is sending information to Google, they can do stuff that, like, they could start talking a different language than any other website would work. And because they control the 2 endpoints, they can do whatever they want. So for example, we talked about the Speedy protocol, which was mainly used by Google, and they used it with themselves. So if you had Chrome and you were visiting Google, then it would actually use a completely different protocol that was experimental and saved some time in terms of efficiency. And so anyways, they have a lot of leverage. So one thing that they did, quite some time ago, but what they did is they started hard coding Google's keys, because they knew their keys. So they would hard code them into Chrome or into Android. And so if you were ever using Chrome or Android and you went to a fake Google website, i.e. A website that had a valid certificate for Google that was actually issued by one of these 600 companies, but was not the certificate that Google themselves were using, because they know, we always get our certificate signed by ourselves, and our certificate is signed by this other company. They know that information, so they hard coded it. And so if you got your weird Google certificate from Ford and you started intercepting traffic and it was coming from a user that was using Chrome, Chrome would say, hey, that's not right. And Chrome would actually phone home and it would send it to Google and say, hey, I just saw this weird Google certificate from Ford. It's totally valid, but I know that that's not a real certificate. And so after they kind of turned this on in Chrome, then they caught, there were 2 high profile cases, DigiNotar and Komodo, that were caught very quickly of sort of bad intermediary website or certificates that had some fake Google certificates. Okay. So what that means is that if you look through this list, you can try and find, which of these 600 companies has the weakest security. And if you can just breach one of them, then you can start minting certificates for yourself, and then you can intercept traffic. And I'll show you how exactly you do that in a second. Another concern with CAs is these CAs are all over the world. Okay. And so CAs, especially the intermediate certificates, they could be in any country in the world. And a certificate in one particular country can issue, a CA in one particular country can issue certificates for any other country anywhere else in the world, even for government websites and things like that. Okay. And so there's always been concern about what if one of these certificate authorities is in a country and we don't really trust the government of that country. Okay. And so there was a sort of example of it, not directly with certificates itself, But in the UAE, the big sort of telecom there, Etisalat, it had been caught earlier putting spyware into sort of the firmware versions of your phone. So you get a phone, you buy it from the store, it comes with some firmware, and sometimes you can push updates over the air. And so there was some surveillance technology that was being put into the phones that were using this provider, and it was thought that the government was trying to compel them in order to do it. Then it turned out that, oh, this is a company that also has CA power, right? And so then people like EFF, for example, became very concerned about whether this company could be compelled by their government to create fake certificates that could be used to spy on either their own citizens or other people, where they could sort of get in the middle of that connection. Now, I want to say there's no evidence that they ever did that. Okay, so this was just purely connecting the dots between one thing that there was some evidence that they did and another thing that hypothetically they could have done. And so there was a big petition to get them banned or to get their certificate revoked by the person who had issued it because it was an intermediate certificate. I don't know the outcome of that, so I don't know whether it was revoked or not. I just know that there was a New York Times article about it and it was kind of news at the time. Okay, final thing I'll talk about is, okay, so you are able to take over a CA, great. You got your fake Google certificate. How do you actually use that? Like what are the steps to actually using that to break someone's connection? And so first off, you would have to target a user. So let's say you're going to target Alice. Second thing is you'd have to get on the line between Alice trying to connect to Google. So you'd have to wait for Alice to actually try to connect to Google for real. Okay. Then what you would do is you would intercept it. So you would see that Alice is trying to make a tunnel between herself and Google. And you would say, hey, I have a valid Google certificate. So I can be the endpoint of that tunnel, right? So when Alice says, hey, I want to form a tunnel, Eve is sitting here and she basically says, hey, I'm Google. Here's my certificate. Yeah, that sounds great. Let's make that tunnel. Okay. And then what Eve can do is she could actually forward Alice's original request onto google.com, the real website. And so she could have, whether this is secure or not, doesn't really matter, but let's just assume it was secure. So she could have a tunnel between herself and Google. And then so if Alice logs into Gmail, then Eve logs into Gmail. And then if Alice asks for the second message, then Eve passes that on to Google. Google responds with the second message, and then Eve passes the second message on to Alice. So Eve can just relay the information back and forth. But every time a password goes across or a cookie or something like that, Eve can write them down, and then she can go and she can look at whatever email she wants. It doesn't matter if Alice requests it or not. Eve now knows Alice's password or her cookie, and so Eve can just directly log into Alice's Gmail account and do whatever she wants from it. Okay. So in general, that's how it happens. We've seen it in the wild. So in the case of Komodo and DigiNotar, people were actually doing this attack. So they got some certificates for big websites like Google and Facebook, and they were sitting in the middle and they were intercepting this traffic as it went back and forth. Okay, so that's basically how you do a man in the middle with a fake certificate. All right, so that's enough for today's lecture. And so next week, we'll keep digging at this problem of this problem here. So notice, let me just go back real quick to tease what's going on next. We kind of solved this first issue. You'll recall the first issue was Alice has a certificate. How does she know that it belongs to the CA? Okay, well, the thing is the CA certificates are hard baked into her computer. Now, you might ask the original question, well, why can't Google's public key be hard baked into Alice's computer? And the thing is just scalability. You can't take every website on the web and put it into someone's computer. So by having 50 CAs in the computer, even though that's a big amount, it's not anywhere near the 2 million websites or whatever it is that have SSL enabled. Okay. And so you have 50 of these, and these 50 companies can enlist another 200 to 600 companies to help them out. And then these 200 to 600 companies can issue certificates for 2 million websites. Okay. And so that's why it's easier to figure out what the key of a root certificate is than to figure out the key of an actual website. The other thing is that website keys tend to change. So when you get a certificate, it usually only lasts like something like a year. Whereas these root certificates, you can actually see there's an expiration date here, and so you can see that they don't expire for decades in most cases. So anyway, so this first issue, we'll consider that resolved. Okay, so that's good. But the second issue, how did the CA figure out? So for example, this CA issued a certificate to this website. How did they know that this was actually the website? Okay, that's an open question. So we haven't talked about this particular question. And then why can't I just do, whatever they do in order to make this work, why can't I just do that myself? Okay, and so that's where we'll go next in the lecture next week. Okay, so thank you, and have a good rest of your day or night whenever you're watching this.